Hello everyone, welcome to Read the Right Thing. I'm your host, Eric. Hope you're doing well. So this book, if you're in the mood for something bleak, dark, sad, cold, those are some of the words that come to mind when I think of this book. I found this book at a used bookstore in Reno called Sundance Books. If you ever happen to be in Reno, go check it out. It's a pretty cool little store. I was browsing the used section and this book sort of just popped out to me. I was in the mood for something kind of gritty and real. The bookstore Sundance, it's a really cool bookstore. It's in this mansion built in 1906. Every room has different genres. They have a used room and a fiction room and a room dedicated to travel. They even have a room where they sell music, CDs, and vinyl. So it's pretty cool. Check it out. Get a picture for the gram, I guess. Buckman writes a story spanning 3 generations of men living in a Midwest town. And they all deal with scars. Scars both on the outside and the inside. Grief, sorrow, anger, chaos, misery, and dark family secrets drives this story. It's a look into the souls of those that have experienced the worst mankind has to offer. War, violence, lies, drinking, drugs, homelessness. These characters live a life in the shadows of war. If you're anything like me, then this novel will really haunt you while you're reading it and after you read it. The story is biblical in nature. It examines the relationships between fathers and sons and the relationship that men have in general. It also asks the questions, can men really overcome their past? Especially when the past is so violent and terrible as the past of these men. The 3 men battle their own ghosts of experiencing war. Bruno Koenig, the father and grandpa, he fought in World War II, or what is considered in this story, and I'm sure what some Americans consider the good war, as if any war were actually good. You know, it is kind of interesting. Most media, whether it's books, films, television, there's definitely a different tone to World War II than, say, the Vietnam War. The soldiers of World War II, for whatever reason, when they came home, they may have not struggled as much to find a place as the Vietnam soldiers did. Bruno Koenig fought with the 1st Infantry Division in Omaha. He fought in Omaha Beach to Dachau and then on to Buchenwald. These characters seem so real and familiar, it's no wonder that Buckman has experienced war himself. Buckman said about the character Bruno that Bruno Koenig is a compilation of my uncles and grandfathers who fought in the European theater of operations during World War II. He's familiar with these types of characters and these types of men who have fought in this war. And I think that shows in the character. Buckman really understands that type of man who fought in that war. Bruno has 2 sons, Bruce and Lynn, and they have troubles of their own. Bruce is a violent alcoholic. He still wrestles with his own homosexuality. We learn in the early pages that he fell in love with a fellow soldier and he blew up his own foxhole with a grenade. Bruce crossed East Avenue and drove past General Foods and Roper Stove. The factories white lit and illuminating the rain as if ships at sea. The street went curbless, empty, and unswerving along the railroad tracks, the traffic lights drooling on the glass between wiper passes. He ran a finger over his scars while he drove and felt each marring until he saw some 15 years back into the hole at Quezon, with a boy so blond and beautiful, an infant's face upon the lank body of a Marine rifleman. He was asleep, wound in a muddy poncho, while the mist turned orange by dawn's light and the white birds flew over from the green hills as if retracing the way of the rockets that had struck in the night. After the attack, Bruce had loved this boy and held his face against the tightness of his stomach, but in the dawn he leaned into the back parapet of the hole with his belt undone, still feeling the wetness of the boy's lips. Bruce looked left down the perimeter. The Marines facing west with their rifles for stand to were only shadows. He held a grenade and rolled its coolness over his mouth. The boy's chest rose and fell with the breath of sleep. Bruce clasped his belt and closed his eyes before pulling the grenade pin, last hearing the fuse crack while it fell in the mud. Lynn's memories also haunt him. He's a heroin and prostitution addict. Luke is the grandson. He's also the neglected son of Bruce. There's a slim chance he won't follow the same path of his family members, but his bleak surroundings are definitely working against him. This family is laden with an enormous amount of grief brought on from war memories, alcoholism, drug addictions, a past rape, and a bleak Midwestern town that they call home. Everything about this book is somewhat bleak. Even the setting is bleak. You find yourself just shivering reading about this sort of harsh, cold, wet Midwestern town. If you've ever experienced a Midwestern winter, you probably know a little bit about what that's like. It just bites. It just bites at you. Oh, it's so cold. This is one of the fiction books that captures the emotions of war and post-traumatic stress as good or better than a nonfiction account could, in my opinion. A nonfiction account, although real, might not capture the depth and darkness of war and its effect on the returning soldiers. These emotions are definitely real. Just because the characters aren't real doesn't mean this story isn't real. I could easily see many American men, returning soldiers, and families experiencing things like this, similar to what the Koenig family experiences in this book. Some movies and books, they tend to glamorize war, but this book does not. Buckman said about Luke, the grandson, and the story overall, he said, "I wanted to write a novel about what continuing a military tradition in the family, which is often portrayed as fluffy on network morning shows, does to a family after some hard generations in American century wars and untreated PTSD running like an open sore between generations." So I think that quote says it right there. Soldiers come home and they're lauded as heroes, but are they really necessarily treated and given the things that they need to succeed and cope with the things that they've experienced? It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have all the answers. But I definitely know that if you read a book like this, you'll definitely empathize more with soldiers. And I think it's important to read books like this, not just because war is entertaining and darkness is entertaining and bleakness is sometimes entertaining, but it's important to understand the experiences of others. I never fought in a war, and I don't even necessarily know anyone who fought in World War II or Vietnam. But now I feel like I sort of have an insight into those experiences. Another interesting thing about Buckman is he's vice president and managing fiction editor for Military Experience and Arts. So he teaches veterans how to write and read. Buckman is a mentor to these returning soldiers. Buckman, he believes that writing can help individuals cope with their trauma. And I think that's right for all sorts of trauma. Whether we experience trauma, big or small, really writing through it can help us work out the events in our mind and really cope with them. Buckman said, "Writing has historical credibility in helping veterans not only define their individual PTSD into a manageable narrative that will need periodic adjustment over time, but it has made many veteran writers who never dreamed they would be writers become respected authors." Buckman also encourages these veterans to read authors like Crane and Hemingway, O'Brien and Vonnegut. These authors show that veterans have been writing for a long time. I think veterans definitely have a lot to say. They've risked everything and laid everything out on the line. They've made sacrifices that only the greatest of Americans sacrifice. So I think it's important that we read veteran authors. I really like this quote that I think is applicable to these veterans, but also everyone in general. He says, "I've seen that the simple act of disciplined running, reading, and writing about the war has brought many vets back from real severe diagnosis. If they have these books close, they are never alone. If they discipline themselves to write well every day and do PT, they will begin to understand their experience, not as an overwhelming mixture of experience and emotional reactions, but as parts of a larger story that they can begin to write and assemble." I think that's a great piece of advice. As long as people have books close by and they have pages that they can write, you're really never alone. So although this novel is bleak, if you're in the mood for something like this, I think it would be a really good book to read. It's important to read books like this that push us. I like to read stuff that's fluffy and feel good as much as the next person. But it's also important to read books like this because it's all about the human experience. And experiencing the human experience isn't just taking in the good, but it's also taking in the bad. It's taking in the harsh and the bleak and the cold. This book, although sorrowful and bleak, is also beautifully written, and I would definitely recommend this. Bruce Koenig came slow through the cornfields where the stalks swayed from the first gestures of a larger wind. His car rode low on its back tires, the trunk overloaded with tools. He crossed the creek and drove toward a clapboard house with a hedge of trees on both sides. Beyond it was ruined corn crib with the boards turned gray from the sun. He went up the gravel lane and past the hickory tree with an engine block dangling by 2 chains. 5 kittens drank water from an upside-down hubcap. He parked the car and walked to the house, then knocked on the storm door while 100 blackbirds flapped south in the dusk to shut themselves of Wauteega County. The door opened. A man in paint-flecked coveralls spat. "You Bruce Koenig?" he said. "Yes, sir." Andy said you'd have scars, so let's see them. Bruce looked up and the man raised the flashlight, but he did not turn it on right away. The birds crowded a wide swath of sky. He eyed Bruce's cheek, rutted like tree bark gone blue. There was the lobless ear that let in wind sounds even when no wind blew. "A gook and a Cheecham grenade did this," Bruce said. "You believe that?" The man came down the porch steps with one leg lagging behind. Bruce saw that it was thinner by the way his pants hung loose. He moved heavily for the trunk of the car, all bent over with a hard paunch and a bony rump. "How'd you get that chain so high in the tree?" Bruce asked. "I think you'd have needed 2 ladders. Nigger rig them somehow." The man shined the light on the trunk lock. The car was red Pontiac with a fist-sized dents across the hood. The weight bulged the tires into air tumors. The man looked at the tires, then at Bruce. He shook his head. So as you can see from the first pages, it's a really gritty story. Every single aspect of this story is similar to that. Even the kittens drink water out of a hubcap. That's kind of just an interesting image in my head. And the cars are dented, it's cold. Even the characters you come in contact with have been scarred somehow. I think this book is definitely the right thing. It was the right thing for me. Thanks for tuning into this video, and keep on reading. Keep on finding those books. And go support used bookstores, especially right now.